something that I would note is just we talked a lot about transfer of power and the election, and it's worth remembering that this president was never given an orderly transition of power. His presidency was never accepted. In fact, before his election, we know Crossfire Hurricane was launched by Peter Strzok to pursue a baseless allegations about the president's ties with Russia. That's before he was president, trying to subvert the will of the American people. We know in August, Peter Strzok wrote a text message about an insurance policy against a Trump presidency, once again trying to silence the voice of the American people. In 2016, we know in October that there was a FISA warrant taken out to spy on the Trump campaign. And then the American people spoke, and they spoke commandingly in electing President Trump despite all of the odds. And what happened after he was elected? You had 70 lawmakers say we're not coming to his inauguration, Democratic lawmakers. You had Elizabeth Warren saying we're going to attempt to obstruct the Trump transition by urging the Government Accountability Office to investigate the incoming Trump transition. In January of that year, you had President Obama have a by-the-book meeting where they talked about the Logan Act, using that act to go after Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Just before the inauguration, you had BuzzFeed promoting and publishing this bogus Steele dossier that's been widely debunked. And then for 2 years, you had the basis Mueller investigation, which searched for collusion, found none, and exonerated President Trump. While in 2016, President Trump became the duly elected president, many sought to undermine him, discredit him, delegitimize him, and deny his victory. There were no calls for unity. There were no calls for healing. So while every legal vote is counted, let us not forget the inexcusable transition or lack thereof that President Trump had to endure in 2016 and 4 years into his presidency. Thank you, everyone, for the very good and substantive questions today. I don't call an activist. I'm not an activist, and you have taken questions since October 1st.
So what you just heard there was Trump Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany call Kaitlan Collins of CNN an activist, saying that she's not really a journalist and she's not going to take questions from a quote-unquote activist, and then kind of leaves the room. And this is after Kayleigh McEnany is basically trying to make excuse after excuse after excuse for why Donald Trump continues to try and take the election away from the American voters, how he's inviting Michigan GOP, legislative lawmakers at the state level to come and basically meet with him in secret to basically plot taking the election. Like, all of these things are happening, and what she's saying is, well, people didn't come to Trump's inauguration party. Some people launched some small lawsuits. Some people explored all of his improprieties, and that means he's allowed to do whatever he wants. And that is BS. But the main point here is the attack on the media. Because look, I get it. I've been critical of CNN and their approach to politics. And I do think there's a critique you can make of mainstream corporate media as being there to defend the status quo, especially when it comes to the left. I think that's reasonable. I think it's reasonable that if you depend on big companies to advertise on your network, you might not always be willing to have, say, a really left-wing position. But the idea that the media by default is anti-Trump and his activism is ridiculous. And that if anything, the only reason they're concerned with Trump is that he is doing unprecedented attacks on democracy. And we also have to make another thing very clear. That even if it's true, let's say it's true, it isn't. Let's say it's true that Kaitlan Collins is an activist, and you shouldn't call on activists because they're not there in good faith. How in the heck does OAN and Newsmax and sources like that, how in the heck do they constantly get called upon by McEnany, and when Trump used to do press conferences, Trump himself? There's been a lot of reporting done about how Donald Trump kept on asking and giving questions to OAN and Newsmax, despite the fact that they are tiny, insignificant networks compared to the mainstream ones, or even, right-wing sources like Fox News. And the reason is because they will feed Trump the softest of softball questions. That those journalists are the most activist-like in the room. That most of the people there on behalf of mainstream networks, yes, even Fox, aren't really activists. They may be journalists with biases that we all have, but they are still fundamentally reporters and journalists. Some may be more right-wing, some may be more left-wing, some may be more centrist. Basically, none of them left-wing. But like some of them more center-left, some of them right-wing, some of them centrist. Like, that's the reality. But they're not activists. If there are activists in the room, they're the ones planted by Trump. And remember this, there was a day, and John Oliver reported on this months ago, when one of the OAN reporters was not invited to the particular press conference because of social distancing. They sort of cycle them in and out. And OAN wasn't invited to that particular day. And so she showed up anyway, the OAN journalist, as the quote-unquote personal guest of the press secretary. I'm going to say that again. Kayleigh McEnany, who hates activists in the press conference room, invited an OAN hack to her press conference as her personal guest. Not the president's, yes, her personal guest. Kayleigh McEnany doesn't give one single damn about activism ruining the presidential press secretary press conference experience. She just doesn't want to take questions that will challenge her worldview. Her and Trump and Republicans all over the country, not every Republican, but Republicans everywhere, are doing things to basically try and overturn the will of the people. If journalists are asking questions about that, they're not being activists, they're doing their job.